Before we get into the fun of reading Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, it's important to understand the ethical framework in which these thinkers are working. Now, the Stoics are notorious for having a lot of technical terminology and having a very complicated system. So what I'm going to try to do now is highlight some of the main features of that, and then explain why actually they're not nearly as scary as they sound. The most general evaluative category for the Stoics is that of value, ta axia, the things which have value. Now, it's going to turn out that goods are a subset of valuable things. So for the Stoic, good isn't the most general evaluative category, value is. Now, things have value if they're in accordance with nature. And we'll find out a little bit more about what the Stoics mean by in accordance with nature later on. But just for now, know that something has value if it's in accordance with nature. The class of valuable things is then subdivided into a class of things which have the kind of value which can contribute to your happiness, and the kinds of things which cannot contribute to your happiness. Among the things that can contribute to your happiness are goods, which bring about happiness, and evils, which detract from happiness. And the class of things that don't contribute to your happiness are what are called indifferents. Now, the class of indifference doesn't contribute to your happiness or take away from your happiness. Nonetheless, what we're going to see is that some of the indifferents are preferred, namely they're to be selected given the choice, and some of them are dispreferred, namely you wouldn't select them if you were given the choice. So again, the general categories are there are goods which contribute to your happiness, and evils which detract from your happiness, and then there are indifferents, some of which are to be selected, and some of which are not to be selected. The Stoics think that virtue is the only good. Virtue turns out to be the only thing which can contribute to your happiness. So, the things that go in the class of goods are just virtue, good character traits, and what participates in virtue. So, the good decisions that a virtuous person makes, and the feelings, the good feelings, the eupathei, that the virtuous person has when they've done a good action, or when they've made a good decision. By contrast, the only evil is vice. The only thing which can make you unhappy is bad character traits. And similarly, they say, so in the class of evils are vice and what participates in vice. So being a bad person, making bad decisions, and the bad feelings that go along with making those bad decisions and living in a bad way. The more unfamiliar category is the category of indifference. Now, they're called indifferents because they make no difference with respect to whether or not you will live a happy or an unhappy life. So everything in the class of indifference you should be indifferent about with respect to your happiness. Nonetheless, the indifferents separate into things which are in accordance with nature and things which are not in accordance with nature. If they're in accordance with nature, they're preferred indifference. They're things that we would rather have than not have if we were given the choice. So examples of this that the Stoics mention include health, wealth, good looks, popularity or a good reputation, success in your project, and friends. So the thought is, ultimately these things aren't going to affect your happiness, but given the choice, you'd rather have them than not have them. By contrast, the dispreferred indifferents are things that you'd rather not have than have if you were given the choice. So a dispreferred indifferent is something like sickness, or poverty, or ugliness, and all of the opposites of the things that we just mentioned. Now there's actually a third category which they mention as well, which are called strict indifference. And those are things which you have no preferences about either way. They're not in accordance with nature, but nor are they contrary to nature. And they say things like whether the number of hairs on your head is odd or even. It literally doesn't matter. It makes no difference whatsoever. There's no way to make a rational choice between those things. Yep, that's exactly right, and that's one of the key claims of Stoic ethics. That a lot of the things that people conventionally take to be good, and the kinds of things which people generally think contribute to their happiness, in fact don't. The reason that the Stoics put all of those things into the category of indifference rather than the category of goods is that the Stoics think that for something to be a good, it has to be such as to benefit. The thought is basically, if something's a good, then it makes your life better. You're better off to have it than not having it. But not all of the things in the category of indifference have that quality. So think about money. You might think that having money is beneficial rather than harmful. But consider someone who comes into a large amount of money and then uses it really badly. So say they win the lottery, and then they become arrogant and alienate their friends, or they use it to buy a lot of hard drugs that end up getting them addicted, and they end up ruining their life because they have all this money which they can spend on bad things. The Stoics would say that the money in that case hasn't actually benefited the person who had it. And there's a perfectly sensible way in which we can say that their life would have been better off, they would have been happier, had they not won the lottery in the first place. But what that means is that money isn't a good because it's not such as to benefit. Whether or not money benefits depended on whether or not it's used well or badly, or as the Stoics would say, whether or not it's used wisely or used foolishly. We can then run the same argument on the other side with respect to the dispreferred indifference. Just because somebody has a dispreferred indifferent doesn't mean that their life is going to be bad or that they're going to be unhappy. In fact, most of the people who you can think of, who you look up to, and who have what we would call happy lives, there are points that they go through where they weren't in a great situation financially. It's often the case that the people we most admire and the people whose lives we think are good also ended up having periods of sickness or periods of solitude, or indeed periods of extreme hardship. And so the Stoics' point is, well, if the preferred indifference aren't sufficient for making you happy, and the dispreferred indifference aren't sufficient for making you have an unhappy life, then it can't be the case that either of them is by nature beneficial or harmful. By contrast, they do think that all good lives, all happy lives, are lives that have been lived virtuously and wisely, and all miserable lives are lives that have been lived in a way which is foolish and in a way which is vicious. A particularly memorable way in which some scholars have put this point that the Stoics are making about the distinction between goods and indifference is by thinking about it in terms of the way in which you live your life and the circumstances of your life. The circumstances of your life are your things that you don't choose, the things that come to you, as it were, and then you have to decide how you respond to them. Whereas the living of your life is how you respond to the circumstances. It's the choices that you make, given the options that you have. And what the Stoics noticed is that all of the indifference form the circumstances of your life. You find yourself afflicted with a particular disease, or you find yourself in a situation of financial hardship, or you find yourself forced to be in a situation where you're alone. What matters is how you respond to that. So your life is effectively made up of your choices and your responses. Those are the things which are in your control, as opposed to the circumstances, which you might be able to indirectly affect, but that you can't just decide. You can't just decide one day to be healthy, and you can't just decide one day what your bank account is going to look like. Nonetheless, you can make good or bad choices in responses to those circumstances. And what the Stoics are going to say is that your happiness ultimately depends on how you live your life, not about the circumstances in which you find yourself. The word that I'm translating as happiness is the Greek word eudaimonia. Now, a lot has been made about this word in contemporary philosophical literature, and even it's getting into some mainstream sources. Now, the reason that people make such a big deal out of this idea is it seems like in a lot of ancient Greek ethics, there's kind of an objective conception of happiness. And given that we tend to think of happiness as more of a subjective feeling, some people think that eudaimonia should be translated as well-being, or it should be translated as flourishing or a good life. Something that has a more objective basis, as opposed to the kinds of feelings that we normally associate with happiness. And part of this, I think, is right. There is definitely an aspect to happiness that is objective for the Stoics. and objective for Greek philosophers more generally. And also they do tend to think about happiness in the context of a whole life, rather than in a particular moment or a particular day, as we're more tempted to. Nonetheless, I actually think this is a bit quick, because if we think a little bit harder, we recognize that there's a subjective and an objective side of happiness as well. And just as the Greeks do, and just as the Stoics do, there's a subjective aspect to happiness, namely how it feels, and there's an objective part of happiness, insofar as we think that people can be wrong about what happiness consists in, and that people can have misguided ideas about when they're happy and when they're not. So let's think a little bit harder about this. It's certainly true that we think that there's a feel to happiness, that there's a way in which happiness kind of consists in your mental states. But the Stoics think this as well. So happiness always involves joy for them and a kind of pride in the actions that you've done if you've acted well. And they also think that it's primarily characterized by what they call an absence of mental distress. The Greek word here is ataraxia, and it often gets translated quite nicely, I think, as peace of mind. So for the subjective side of happiness, there's a kind of peace of mind that's involved in a kind of joy about how your life is going and the decisions that you've managed to make. But we also now think that happiness, and when we think about a happy life, it goes well beyond the idea that happiness is this kind of temporary buzz. So if you think about some of the happiest times of your life, often it's when you're working on a project or something that is much more complicated is going on. And on any given day, it's not like you're feeling the buzzy feelings that you get when someone gives you a gift or, it's a particularly nice day out. You're happy because you're working on something valuable and there's a sense in which you're enjoying what you're doing. But often if you look at the details of it, it's not that you're experiencing this buzz. So say you're working hard on a piano piece and you're practicing a lot, or you're struggling through a math problem, or you're working with other people at your business on a project that's particularly challenging but particularly rewarding. Those are days in which you really do feel like you're living a happy life and that things are going well. But it's not the same kind of buzz that you experience in the more transitory moments of happiness. So insofar as those activities we think compromise a happy life, we recognize that the kind of buzz account of happiness doesn't do justice to all the ways in which the complex and difficult activities of our life actually end up contributing to its value. By contrast, I think we also recognize an objective side to happiness, and this is why I really do feel like eudaimonia should be translated as happiness, even into contemporary English. So think about what has been called the parent at the cradle test. So say you're a mother who's just given birth to your child, and you're kind of praying over them or wishing them a good life. And if you say, I want my daughter to have a happy life, the mother certainly doesn't mean, I hope that she has positive mental states regardless of what she's enjoying. What we tend to mean in those situations is that we hope that her life is valuable and good and that she enjoys it and takes value in the right things. It's not that we hope that all of her preferences are satisfied regardless of what they happen to be. So when we think about wishing someone's life to go well as a whole and wishing for them to have a good life, we mean much more than just that they experience good mental states. And once we start to think harder about what kinds of things in fact then go into making up a happy life, we realize it's not just these positive mental states. We know that people can have happy lives when there are really tough days, months, and even tough years that they have to go through. So it can't just be that a happy life is one that consistently has positive feelings like you're a golden retriever every day. Rather, the idea is that happiness is a kind of complex way about thinking about your life going well. Moreover, we do think that there's an objective side of happiness, and that we think that a happy life is one which it works towards good, worthwhile, and valuable things. It matters how we achieve our goals, and it matters what kinds of things we actually end up taking joy in. If someone is a ruthless businessman who takes advantage of his workers and exploits them, we don't think that his life is happy, even though he might be getting some of the positive mental states. Again, this isn't the kind of life that we mean when we're wishing our child well and we're wishing that our child has a happy life. We don't mean that they're happy insofar as they're taking advantage of other people. And so what this means is that it really does matter not only what our goals are, but how we achieve them. It matters what we take pride and satisfaction in. And of course, by contrast, this means that people can actually think that they're happy when they're not. And so when people talk about true happiness, I think what they're getting at is there's a deeper and more important notion of happiness than just kind of the transitory feelings that we might get when things are going well. We really want it to be such that it's a meaningful kind of happiness. And insofar as we recognize this in our own conceptions, we can see it in the Greeks as well.